All right, so hello and welcome back. So today we're taking a look at World War One from the American perspective in animated history by the Armchair Historian. I have done this video a while ago, but it was not up to the usual Fallout standard, so we're going to redo it, and it wasn't viewed a lot, and I think I have more to add this time. So we're going to take a look at it. Um, just so you know, my if I was going to rank myself on the most knowledge, it'd probably be World War Two first, then World War One, or World War One and then two. It's kind of vice versa there. So, without further ado, let's get to it.
Captain Lloyd W. Williams can hear the sounds of combat. Men of the 5th Marine Regiment pick their way through Belleau Wood, newly arrived to reinforce their flagging French and British allies. Suddenly, forms come bursting from the thick woods. The Marines raise their rifles, but instead of Stahlhelmed Germans, they find their lines swamped by battered French infantry. As their comrades retreat through the American line, a French colonel approaches Captain Williams, but his English is broken and unintelligible. The French officer gives a snort of frustration and pulls a notepad from his kit, scribbling a note. Captain Williams reads the proffered order before fixing his bayonet, uttering 6 words that will echo through the history of the United States Marine Corps. Retreat? Hell, we just got here.
Those words live on. Ask any Marine.
Hi, I'm Griffin Johnson, the Armchair Historian. George Washington, founding father and first president of the United States, famously advised the young country not to involve itself in foreign affairs. Few presidents seemed to take this advice to heart like Woodrow Wilson, who commented before his inauguration that it would be ironic if his presidency was concerned mainly with matters abroad.
We'll get to Woodrow Wilson in a minute. I do not like that man very much, but what George Washington said was true. He said we should avoid foreign treaties and foreign allies as to avoid entanglement in Europe. He was also the only president to not have a political party and completely stay out of party politics, as he saw it as basically beneath himself and the fact that it would tear the country apart, basically did. Another thing about him saying avoid foreign entanglements was that the French Revolution was actually happening during the time that he was actually president. So you could see how helping the French allies, but also not avoiding entanglements, he chose to avoid entanglements, okay? And then, 1812, the War of 1812 happens, and the XYZ affair and all that stuff, because basically we were trying to, long story short, help France, kind of, and then British people impressing our ships led to war, and then we got neutral, which basically means a win for America against Britain. So,
President Wilson's remarks would prove prophetic, as he was the anti-war isolationist who led the United States into the First World War. In this video, we will examine how the US went from a country that simultaneously declared neutrality but supplied the Entente to a major partner in the destruction of the Central Powers.
And not only that, he ran on a peace ticket because he was president 1912 to 1916 and then 1916 until basically his coma touched death in 1920. And he's like, yes, we will not be involved in European politics in 1916. And then he gets us into the war. Reasons for that, obviously, but...
Safe behind its twin moats of the Atlantic and Pacific, the United States watched the development of the First World War with concern. When hostilities broke out in July of 1914, American ambassador to France, Myron T. Herrick, advocated taking an active role in mediation. Expression from our nation would have great weight in this crisis. A strong plea for delay and moderation from the President of the United States would meet with the respect and approval of Europe.
No. Flat out no. Even even in the very end with the Treaty of Versailles, a lot of Americans' demands were ignored. Basically, this was a European war, and America was not Europe. And us trying to get in there and be like, yes, we will be the people that you listen to, that was not going to happen. Okay. This man, our ambassador, was cuckoo because there was no stopping this, and there was no way that America, the president, would be intervening and it would be approved. No, not in 1914, not in 1950.
President Wilson called for neutrality on an existential level, exhorting all Americans to observe neutrality in thought and in deed. To this end, the government prohibited American banks from loaning money to any belligerent nation, an act that the then Secretary of State and noted gold hater William Jennings Bryan hoped would both cement American neutrality and bring the war to a speedy conclusion.
We will just let this play out and see about how long this takes until we actually support the Entente.
One cannot fight with an empty war chest, after all. This fiscal neutrality was not long-lived, as President Wilson reversed the decision in 1915 in response to the British Empire indicating their stockpiles of cash were about to run out, and thus they could not afford to continue buying American goods. Though protesting its neutrality at
Exactly. America, basically, from the beginning of the war, was not quote-unquote neutral in any sense of the word. It's fully supporting the Entente. Again, it'll ramp up way later in 16 and 17, and then full out, just go out and completely support the Entente. But let's not be two ways about it. America was not neutral in World War I.
At each turn, the United States was all too keen to do business with the Entente. With the metaphorical floodgates opened, American creditors sent a veritable tsunami of greenbacks to the British Empire, who turned right around and spent that money in the United States. But the British were not the only foreign shoppers in American markets, as the German Empire too sought to buy critical supplies from Uncle Sam. With the Western Front grinding to a stalemate, Germany hired ships from neutral countries to ferry food and other necessities purchased in the United States to the continent. But British naval supremacy and their blockade of Germany prevented much of it from getting through.
Basically, pretty much all of it. You can see Germany's coastline right here. You could see that they could technically own the Netherlands and Belgium if we're talking about 1915, 16 here. But again, you're not going. There's a massive blockade from basically the British Empire from up here all the way in the North Sea, all the way to Norway. So there's a massive blockade of anything going into Germany. Okay, going through the channel is not an option because you will just be destroyed by coastal artillery and torpedo boats. So that's not an option. So Germany's legitimately cut off from trade from pretty much everywhere except by land.
The United States formally protested the British blockade in March of 1915, but the issue was quietly resolved in a meeting that saw the United States accept a British prohibition on selling food to Germany. When the blockade began impacting American cotton exports and threatening a vital pillar of the economy, Britain agreed to increase their cotton purchases to cover the shortfall. The upshot of all of this economic backroom dealing was an ostensibly neutral United States bowing to any small pressure from the British Empire to stop selling to Germany. Between 1914 to 1916, American trade with the German Empire plummeted by an economy-shattering 99%. Germany, backed to an economic wall, ordered a submarine blockade of Great Britain in retaliation. The United States protested, declaring this to be a violation of international law. This double standard, accepting a British blockade of Germany but not a German blockade of Britain, was acknowledged and waved away by President Wilson, who claimed that the British Navy did not threaten American lives in the same way that Germany's powerful fleet of submarines did. Wilson...
And you have to wonder, why did they not threaten their lives? Wonder if you're giving these people that you're allies that are not shooting at you, versus the people that you're not trading with see that they have no choice and they're shooting at you, and you're like, oh, yeah, I wonder why they're shooting at me. Oh, I don't know, they're bad people.
Wilson was unaware that Germany had only 9 submarines with which to enforce its blockade, hardly the mammoth threat to American life that he seemed to imagine. But the threat was still there, as the sinking of the Lusitania on March 7, 1915, would throw into sharp relief.
So we'll see if he talks about the Lusitania, but I'll add some stuff about this because it's pretty interesting, actually.
The sinking of the RMS Lusitania, which killed 128 American citizens, was only one in a series of incidents that drove the American people further and further into the Entente camp. The American public, already displeased.
Okay, so let's talk about the Lusitania before we get to the little nudging that he's talking about, but it's definitely a factor. So the Lusitania was 100% carrying munitions to Britain, a lot of munitions. Reports from the German sub-captain is when he hit it with the first torpedo, there was um, there was a significant detonation, okay, like you would expect, and then he fired his second torpedo, if I'm remembering correctly, and then he hit something, and then he said there was a massive explosion on the ship. That's definitely not caused by his torpedo, as he accounts for, and there was munitions going off. And when you go look at the wreck today, there's a lot of munitions on there. So technically, you could classify this as a war transport, which does not mean it is a civilian liner. Because the Americans are trying to get around and be like, hey, this is a civilian liner. It does not have explosives on it. You cannot shoot, which was correct. All nations had signed this. You cannot shoot a ocean liner that is completely civilian-like, unless you stop them, get them into the water on their lifeboats, and then proceed to shoot them. But that's usually what you do for cargo ships. Civilian liners are legitimately not a target that you can attack. Unless you throw a whole bunch of supplies on the bottom and then you make it a legitimate target. But we're getting off topic there. But just know that the Lusitania was definitely carrying explosive material, which violated international law if you were going to be a civilian ocean liner that's not a merchantman.
At reports of German atrocities in Belgium, condemned the apparent sinking of a civilian vessel, and a diplomatic back and forth between Washington and Berlin ensued. Calls to enter the war rang in the halls of the capital, stopped only by German promises to scale back their submarine operations. America was pacified for now, but German Americans began to face prejudice at home, prejudice that would only intensify as the war progressed. Doubts of German Americans' loyalty would be continuously raised, with President Wilson declaring that any man who carries a hyphen with him carries a dagger that he is ready to plunge into the vitals of this republic when he gets ready. A nakedly hostile remark towards the largest non-English speaking group in the United States at the time. Government-stoked and homegrown paranoia.
There was a lot of Americans with German ancestry. A lot of Pennsylvanians actually speak it's their own technically form of German. It's their own dialect, really. There are even some Texans that actually speak German, and it's very broken German if you come over here. But it is a thing. So Germany or Germans were a large set minority. I won't even almost call them a minority. I would just call them a percentage of the American population at this point. And yeah, there was a lot of discrimination against them, and this will play out in World War II also. So.
Escalated into violence, with German Americans shot, forced from their homes, or lynched, such as the case of Robert Paul Prager, a naturalized citizen who was lynched as a spy in April of 1918. This hatred was further stoked by an incredible act of sabotage. As previously mentioned, the Entente funneled much money to Yankee businesses, including munitions plants. Germany, unable to buy American weaponry thanks to the British blockade, began sending spies to find where the Entente was procuring and transporting weapons and munition, and to halt the flow of materiel, if possible. One such point of departure.
Before we get to this harbor explosion, we'll just mention this. The fact that Britain was being secured a lot of munitions at this point from the United States. For example, I'll give you an example of this. Britain had been working on a rifle that they were going to replace the Lee Enfield with before the Great War broke out. They didn't get to do that because the Great War broke out and they can't switch production lines very fast. However, they had the P-14, and it would be a lot faster for American manufacturers to spool up the P-14, which was the pattern 14 rifle that they were going to replace the Lee Enfield with, spool that up in America and ship it over to Britain, okay? The Lee Enfield, you have to have a lot of fine tooling, a lot of old world stuff over there that's already set up in England. They don't want to transfer that to America and do all that. So P-14, pattern 14, a lot easier to spool up in America, so they do. So they just continuously produce P-14s all the way and send them to Britain, okay? Here's a fun fact about this. in 1917, we have a 1917 pattern. I think it's 1917 Enfield. If I remember correctly, I'll look this up. Okay, so you can see what I'm talking about here. We have a 1917 U.S. rifle, M1917 Enfield. Okay, so this is what I was talking about. This rifle, again, was the P14 or pattern 14, as you can see here. In 303, we made it into 308. Because America, or 30-06, because America. But this is one of the rifles that we actually took, modified a little bit, 1917, and then 1918. And then this rifle actually was more in use in World War I by American forces than the actual Springfield 1903. And specifically, if you take a look at this rear sight was very good, liked by pretty much every troop that used it, compared to the Springfield that has a leaf sight. If you know what that is, it's not very good. And the rear aperture of this sight would be actually added to the 1903 A4 version of the Springfield, if I'm remembering correctly. But this is just one of those things that you wouldn't really think of, that, hey, Britain needed rifles, so they produced a rifle over in America, sent it to them, and then we took that rifle and then produced it and then used it in World War I in great numbers.
Point of departure was Black Tom Island in New York Harbor, and on July 30th, 1916, German agents decided to have a little fireworks show. Igniting over $20 million worth of stockpile munitions, the Germans created one of the largest non-nuclear explosions in human history. A shockwave equivalent to a magnitude 5 earthquake was felt as far away as Philadelphia. The Statue of Liberty was damaged, and Black Tom Island was devastated. 110 by 50 meter crater left behind by the blast. Momentum was
and this actually, this was like the largest explosion. There was also another incident in Canada, and you can write in the comments if you remember this. There was another incident in Canada where a munitions ship basically went off, and then there was another one up there where I believe two ships collided with each other, and it could have ended in a massive detonation and just killed everything up there. But again, these large man-made explosions, actually a lot of them happened in World War I, if you can believe it or not.
Left behind by the blast. Momentum was steadily building for the United States to enter the war. And in a display of military acumen that would make von Bismarck proud, German planners determined that the best way to keep the United States from entering wars was to actively target their merchant shipping and threaten American lives. Their rationale was simple: bringing back unrestricted submarine warfare and sinking every ship headed to Britain, American or not, would starve the Entente into submission and end the war before the United States could even be moved to intervene. American ships were sunk, but President Wilson, just barely re-elected, continued to demur, instead proclaiming armed neutrality by ordering American ships to be armed and authorized to fire on any aggressor. As their ships were raided...
As he said, he barely elected 1916. He ran on a platform of, we're not getting involved in this, and then gets involved a year later. So you could see how that would be a problem.
And more were lost. The American public began clamoring for more than just armed neutrality. President Wilson continued to resist, but his efforts were ended by the infamous Zimmerman telegram, an order by the German foreign minister to his men in Mexico to court America's southern neighbor with promises of recovering territory in Texas, Arizona, and New Mexico if they would invade the United States for the Central Powers. President Wilson, faced with all...
And that's just a big no-no, okay? That's just a big no-no. You do that to America, that's basically almost a declaration of war. At that point, the Zimmerman telegram was legitimately the last final push America really needed to get into the war.
All of these pressures asked his cabinet for advice, and found a single word on all of his advisors' lips. Both houses of the United States Congress passed resolutions supporting a war on Germany, and President Wilson formally requested Congress acknowledge a state of war had been created by Germany's actions rather than declare war outright.
Which is basically a political way of saying, he attacked me, I'm just defending myself. Legitimately, almost every single country tries to do this.
Congress responded by declaring war outright on April 6, 1917.
And this is a very key fact. They only declared war on Austro-Hungary in December, but not against any other Central Power, which would mean Bulgaria, the Ottoman Empire. I think that's it. Yeah, Austro-Hungary, basically every other Slav in there. Because there wasn't. Yeah, I don't think there really was one. Romania was dead. So yeah.
Neutrality had ended, and it was time to go over there.
Over there. This is a 1903 Springfield. Now, I'm assuming, because I saw them also in the beginning, that we're not going to see a 1917 Enfield, which is a shame. But as you can see, this is a leaf sight, or barley corn sight, and the rear aperture sight is missing here, but that's what was on the Enfield. And you can see that basically, long story short, the human eye is very good at putting a hole and lining it up on a sight. So, and the fact that you could also have a rear sight here means you have a longer distance, and that improves accuracy, blah, 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 getting into a lot of shit. That it probably shouldn't be, but there you go. So, yeah, this is a 1903 Springfield. That's how you can very easily tell if they're a 1917 or a Springfield. Springfield have these, 1917s have rear aperture sights.
The United States that entered the First World War was far from a military power. Isolationism had taken its toll on America's armed forces, leaving President Wilson to call up a minuscule standing army and dust off a navy of aging battleships. This, in a way, suited the president just fine, as Wilson believed the simple act of entering the war would tip the balance of power firmly in the favor of the Entente. While the British and French clamored for a fight to the finish, Wilson had his gaze fixed firmly on bringing the Germans to the negotiating table, and truly making this the war to end all wars. With the passage of the Selective Service Act, widespread conscription swelled the Americans' numbers. 2 million men had volunteered at the outbreak of war, and conscription would see 2.8 million more go over there.
And I will actually bring up some stats on this because Selective Service is very interesting. Okay, so let's point something out. When we say Selective Service Act of 1917, it is referring to Congress passing basically a draft for all intents and purposes. Now, America has done this before. We did it in the American Civil War. We've done it in a few wars before then, passed. But this is like a really big one. And another thing to remember about this one specifically is that it also passed the Selective Service System on May 18, 1917, which is the same May 18, 1917 as the Selective Service Act. The Selective Service System is what actually all of us American males, including myself, are in and on. This is the draft. This is the, hey, we're calling you up. And this one is still in effect to today. And we use it in World War II, World War I, Vietnam. This is the whole thing right here. All of it. As always, this is the first time we established the draft to be like a formal thing that will always be around. And this is the war that starts it. So there you go. And let's mention this. Okay, so the American Army in 1916 was tiny. Okay, absolutely tiny. 50, 100,000 guys. If that. I'll actually go look up a number on this. So numbers I found, 200,000, 300,000 active-ish regular guys. Okay, as you can see, 2 million people volunteered, 2.8 million were conscripted from 1917 to 1918. That's a lot of people. You also have to take into account that because our army was... Okay, let's get into this a little bit. The American army was divided into, and this is how it has always been until World War I, basically. There's a regular army that basically does a lot of training and trains all other people. Okay, that's really what it's for. It's a very small force. Then there's the American National Guard. Okay, that is massive. That is a militia system. That is a system that has always been used to fight off foreign invasions, or go and liberate Cuba, Puerto Rico, and the Philippines. Okay, all of those guys are National Guardsmen, and National Guard training back then was not very good. It was just not very good at all. There was no standardized training. You basically went to your state, and they taught you how to be infantry for every single state. And it was a disjointed system, but that's a system we had because we didn't want to have a big standing army because that could be used to overthrow the United States and blah, 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 blah. But just know that the National Guard would be called up, and that's the majority of the actual army basically fighting in World War I, more or less. Now, the regular army will, of course, the National Guard will be folded into the army, but that's different. But there's a lot more National Guard soldiers than there is regular army soldiers. At least that's the point I'm trying to make here.
Whether volunteers or conscripts, Yankee troops began making their way to Europe. American troops landed on European shores in June of 1917. British and French commanders initially viewed the newly arrived Americans as reinforcements they could use to supplement their dwindling numbers.
Oh no. Oh no. If you don't have children, they should leave, but hell no. So this was one of the things that I actually give Blackjack Pershing credit for. I don't like that man. I have problems with him. But we'll get into him when we get into Blackjack Pershing, or at least we'll start talking about American forces. I'll get into it a little bit. The reason I don't like that man. But he said the AEF, the American Expeditionary Force, will all fight as one force. We are not going to support other units. We are not going to be piecemealed into be like raw replacements for British and French commanders. That's not happening. Okay. Now that might be very nationalistic, but literally every country's done that since their founding. World War II is legitimately no exception. Units of foreign, so Belgian, I think Luxembourg might be one exception there, but Belgian, French, British, and American units always fought under their own officers and in their own units. There might be subs attached to different armies and corps and stuff, but that's different. Just know that there was no way in hell that Americans were going to be put under British and French command and be substituted into their units. That was not happening.
Some black soldiers, including the famous Harlem Hellfighters, were folded into the French army for the duration of the war. But General John Blackjack Pershing...
Yeah, the 351st Hellfighters are an amazing group of Americans, okay? They're African-American Americans that could not fight in the American army because we were racist, very racist back then. I wasn't allowed to join the army, so let's put it that way. But yes, they did amazing work in France fighting for the French army. And we'll continue with Blackjack Pershing now.
Infamous pacifier of the Philippines and commander of the American Expeditionary Force, sought to keep his men together in a unified American army. Pershing would largely get his way, and the first major engagement fought by the Americans would come the following summer, the Battle of Contin. A German salient at the village of Contin represented a golden opportunity to Pershing, who committed the 1st Infantry Division, better known as the Big Red One, to wipe it out. This strike would not only consolidate Entente lines, but Pershing hoped seeing the Americans in action would boost French confidence in their American comrades. At 6:45 a.m. on May 28, 1918, American infantry advanced under cover of French artillery. French tanks and flamethrower detachments advanced alongside the Yanks, and the combined force advanced up the slopes of Contin. Despite the help of the French gunners, tankers, and air support, the Americans were mauled during the uphill battle, yet they succeeded in capturing the village. German counterattacks began not long thereafter, but the Americans held firm, turning back 2 days of offensives and keeping a firm grip on Contin. The Americans accomplished their objective of not only taking the village, but also demonstrating that they could be counted on in a scrap. That scrap would come at...
And we will get to Battle of Wood. But yes, this is like the first time the Americans are like, yeah, we can actually, stand and fight, because 17 American troops were not very good. I don't need to tell anyone this. When they haven't been fighting for 3 years and then you put them in and they all die, it's, because they don't have steel helmets, they don't have the training, X, Y, and Z, so...
Belleau Wood. A German offensive punched a hole in French lines, and the US Marines were sent to plug the gap, pushing back the German assault and repelling numerous attempts to reopen the hole. From there, the Marines assaulted critical German positions in and around Belleau Wood, taking heavy casualties but accomplishing their objectives. It was among the trees of Belleau that Marine lore could be written. Captain Williams' refusal to retreat has become the motto of the 5th Marines. But Belleau Wood and Contigny were only the prelude to the largest offensive in American military history to that point. From September 20...
Let's talk about the Marines, okay? Marines to play literally no part in the European theater in World War II. They're always in the Pacific. World War I is different. World War I, they actually fight in Europe, but they are a tiny force. I believe it's like over 30,000 people, maybe. But what they make up for being that small is that they are the expeditionary force that America sends literally everywhere in the 19th century, and the 19th and 20th century. If you need to go fight drug dealers and terrorists, is what they called them, and liberation fighters, In Nicaragua, you send the Marines. You send the Marines with Thompsons to get the problem done or to deal with the problem. So Marines have a lot of actual combat experience, and they're a tiny force, but they do put up a really good fight for being so tiny.
26th to November 11th, 1.2 million American troops embarked on the Meuse-Argonne offensive, aimed at capturing the railhead at Sedan. The offensive hit immediate stumbling blocks, as the Americans deployed inexperienced units already weakened by the Spanish flu. As the battle dragged on, both the Americans and the French sent troops to shore up the line. The Entente spirits would be lifted by an incredible act of heroism. Corporal Alvin York, a sharpshooting infantryman from the 82nd Infantry, now the 82nd Airborne, killed 25 and captured 132 Germans, a feat that would earn him the Medal of Honor. In a bid...
Yes. And there are many movies made about Alvin York that you can actually go watch. It's quite impressive. And one thing about the Spanish flu, or two things. One, didn't originate in Spain, originated in America. Arkansas is where we legitimately think it originated in. I think it was a hospital down there when they first found it. But the reason it's called Spanish flu is the Spanish press was the one that was legitimately the only free press in the world at the time, so they reported it, and therefore they got labeled the Spanish flu. Yeah. Second, the Spanish flu did impact everyone in World War I. America lost more troops from disease than they did from combat. That doesn't change. That never changes, basically, for most powers up until World War II. World War II is the exception. More people actually die than they die from disease. World War I is still disease overall, is the most lethal killer.
To break the stalemate, the Big Red One assaulted the German stronghold at Côte du Châtillon, an imposing position that American Lieutenant General Robert Bullard described thus: not a line, a net, 4 kilometers deep, wire interlaced knee-high in grass, wire tangled devilishly in forests, pillboxes in succession, one covering another. No foxhole cover for gunners here, but concrete masonry. Bits of trenches, more wire, a few light guns. Defense in depth. The mighty First was repulsed by this net, but their loss was quickly avenged by your friend and mine, Douglas MacArthur of the 42nd Rainbow Division, a patchwork of National Guard troops from states from Iowa to Alabama. The Guardsmen were able to succeed where the Big Red One failed, cracking Côte du Châtillon and turning the tide of the offensive, just in time for the armistice to be signed on November 11th.
And one thing about MacArthur, he actually goes from, I'll look this up, we'll look it up together. All right, so Douglas MacArthur, everyone knows this man. I'm not going to get into the National Army. That's too much. Okay, but just so you all know, in the regular army, which is the regular army, he was a major in 1915, so basically in 1916 almost. Then when World War I, he gets involved in World War I. In August 1917, he gets promoted to colonel in the infantry. Now, he skips lieutenant colonel, which is impressive. Then in July, not even a single year after he gets colonel, he gets brigadier general, okay? So he is actually very young. I believe he's in his 30s when he becomes a brigadier general, and that is quite impressive for him, as you can imagine. And I'll see, yes, here he is. Here's the boy. Here is the boy, okay? So this is him in 1918. You can see that he is totally magnificent. I have problems with MacArthur, by the way. But one thing you can see, let's see if we can find his date of birth. So he was born in 1880. So he's not even 30. He's not even 30 by the time he's a brigadier general. He's 28. If I'm doing math correctly, 38. 20? 30? He's 38 years old when he becomes a brigadier general, which is almost unheard of. Okay? So that's just one of those things you can look about Douglas MacArthur.
America would prove as active in peace as they were in the final days of the war. President Wilson brought his 14 points to the negotiations at Versailles and pushed for these principles to provide the bedrock for the post-war world. Wilson envisioned a League of Nations that would promote global peace and provide a diplomatic alternative to fighting. Wilson also sought to impose his peaceableness on Europe as a whole, dismantling the old colonial system and promoting self-determination for all peoples across the world. But Wilson's ideas were not universally accepted, with the previously mentioned Secretary of State Lansing remarking that promoting self-determination would raise hopes which can never be realized.
We'll actually go look at the 14 points. So this is true. Before we'll get into point number 6, but Wilson pushed for self-determination, allegedly intrigued Ho Chi Minh, who tried to visit Wilson for Vietnamese independence at Versailles, and Wilson wouldn't see him. That the self-determination, by the way, this thing was okay. Let's break this down. So he wanted self-determination for white Europeans. Very plain. Just get that out. White Europeans only. He wanted self-determination for everyone else in the world, but you would be guided by American principles. And then when we felt you were ready, you could then be self-determining after that. But only when we felt you were ready. But he wanted, basically, if you were a Bohemian, to have, Czechoslovakia, or the Czechs go for Czechoslovakia, or Slovakia. Slovaks have Slovakia, the Czechs have the Czech Republic. You get what I'm saying here. But basically, every country, it was really targeted the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Like, everyone that's in there. Hungarians, form Hungary. Stuff of that sort. So let's go look at the 14 points. Okay. I don't know if I'll read all of these, but I just think it's interesting that his points. Okay, so 1, open covenants for peace, openly arrived at which there shall be no private international understanding, so no secret treaties of any kind, but diplomacy shall proceed always, frank and in public view. Absolute freedom of navigation upon the seas, but all removal. So again, you can see all of his points here. They're actually pretty good. And the League of Nations will exist, just won't have a lot of power, but it will actually do a lot of things that actually set up for the Nuremberg trials and the Tokyo trials, because technically Japan and Germany violated the League of Nations from proposals and affirmations that have already been set up before. And point number 6, the evacuation of all Russian territories and such a settlement to all questions affecting Russia as will secure the best and freest cooperation of other nations in the world, obtaining for her an unhampered and unbiased opportunity for independent determination of her political development and national blah, 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 blah. What this is really trying to tell you is that we should probably leave Russia alone and stop interfering. Yeah, but the problem is they're communist, and literally every single nation in Europe will get involved in some way of sending support to the White Army to fight against the communist Reds. It won't work, needless to say.
Lansing, remarking that promoting self-determination would raise hopes which can never be realized, and that the phrase is simply loaded with dynamite. The British and French were equally skeptical, with the French representative only reading Wilson's points when the German delegation requested that they be the basis of the peace talks. Fearing that the Americans and Germans would conclude a separate peace based on Wilson's ideas, the French and British accepted the 14 points as Germany requested. Wilson became quite popular for his peacemaking image.
He was, actually, and he also saw himself as a Jesus figure. He saw himself as above the average man, but we'll get this. But yes, he actually was very involved in foreign diplomacy and foreign policy. He just completely forgot about a domestic policy, and that's what really bit him in the ass. Because he couldn't get the America to join the League of Nations. He always felt himself as a diplomat and out there in the world, and did not really focus on America, which bite him in the ass, more or less. And this is true. The 14 points and America's stance on Germany was a lot less harsh than what the French and the British were coming up with. The occupation of the Rhineland, taking all their industrial might, Treaty of Versailles, all of that. Wasn't going to be that bad with the Americans. So that's why Germany was like, yes, we should, America, please help.
And his League of Nations was formally established in 1920. But neither the Treaty of Versailles, which ended the First World War, nor the United States' entry into the League of Nations were approved by Congress, a sign that isolationism had returned to America's shores. America's war was over, for now.
And that is true. Again, he more than likely, we're talking about alternate history here, but if he stopped being such a Europhile and diplomacy everywhere, he probably more than likely could have actually got the Americans to join the League of Nations, at the very least. And that would have been a lot more stable for the League of Nations, because the League of Nations, as we all know, was basically dead from the start. It actually did accomplish a lot of legal matters, and actually, because I'm learning about this, more legal matters and like procedures on how things were done in an international court, and how disputes were supposed to be solved. All of that as actually what the League of Nations established, okay, without the U.S., and then dies in World War II, and then comes back as the UN. But the UN is calling back to the League of Nations, basically getting all of their agendas and all the legal documents from there. So the League of Nations is actually very important, basically for human history, because it's the one place you could actually go to in the interwar period to actually negotiate with people. Because remember, before the League of Nations, there was no like big international organization where you could just negotiate with a whole bunch of countries and see what they're doing. That wasn't a thing.
Participation in the war to end all wars brought America onto the world stage in an unprecedented fashion, but the public's desire to return to a quiet isolation dashed any hopes that President Wilson had of his country leading the world into a new era of peace and international cooperation. The League of Nations would go on to crumble under the weight of its members' indifference to its decisions, specifically the open defiance of the Japanese Empire in the 1930s. German Americans came out of the war browbeaten into hiding their culture and assimilating. While before the war a full quarter of American high school students studied the German language, by 1918 only 1% of high schools even had German offered as a class.
Think about that. 25% of them took it. German was a language. Again, I won't even call them a minority. I call them a pretty large percentage of the American population. They're 20% of German descent. So yeah, losing the German language is one of the effects the American school system affected or felt. Even today, it's one of those things. Like, at least down here in the South, we learn a lot of Spanish, French, and it's taught. And you can take German, I think, some high schools, but it's very rare now.
Ultimately, it would take another world war and a new president to see Lady Liberty take the center stage in world affairs again.
Alright, so that's the video. So hopefully you liked me rambling for 48 minutes. But hope you guys like this. Hope you guys like my redo of this, really. And expanding on it more. So I hope I brought this video up to the Fallout standard. So if you guys like this video, please like. If you like this content, you can subscribe. And thank you to my patrons. Thank you to you for watching. And you can click up there to watch another one of my reactions. Alright, see people later.